Could I ask you to dwell on the Vendée?
Okay, all right, sure.
Because
sure.
I'd like to bring the story forward also to one of your most recent ideas,
Okay.
which is the emphasis on causal mechanisms.
Oh, yeah,
in,
yeah.
I think the title is Social Dynamics of Contention. Or
Just dynamics of contention,
Dynamics
we
of
call it.
Contention, with Douglas McAdam
Yeah. And
yourself,
Sid Terrell.
and Sid Terrell. And in some ways, it's treating very similar empirical phenomena
Yeah.
to the Vendée. My recollection as you began talking about the Vendée is, I remember very vividly you talking about the role of the Catholic Church as a basis
Yes.
of organization and a kind of differentiator, and also the material interests of wine growers and I think grain
That's right,
growers.
that's right, that's right.
So here's my question for you. Personally, I find the move to specific kind of ground level social mechanisms of contention to be a very useful step. And what I'm wondering is if you were now to look back to the research you did on the Vendée, whether the perspective of causal mechanisms, social mechanisms, would change your analysis, would change the way you did the research, or possibly even change the findings.
Oh, well, the answer is deeply. I mean, maybe other people have had this experience and they've suppressed it, but my first book refuted my doctoral dissertation. And that had one advantage, and that is that the author wasn't going to complain about being refuted. But that was precisely because I had in the dissertation still presented some very large entities, urbanization, and a kind of glimmering of modernization. I didn't use quite that term and so forth, but the notion of two societies that were differentially exposed to the modern world was really there, so forth. And I realized between defending my dissertation and writing the book that became The Vendée, there was a period of about 6 years it took me to rework the material, that this appeal to large categories wasn't working very well, and that what I really had was a story about the process. I had no idea about mechanisms at that point, or I'll save myself by saying I had an intuitive sense, but I certainly didn't have the vocabulary. And if I had had the vocabulary, if somebody had made it available to me in 1958, I would have written a different book in 1964, I'm sure. As it turned out, I think the situation must have been a little bit like what my friend and colleague Harrison White says. He said, Harrison is a genius in the study of social networks and markets and related processes. He says, I've never had a good idea that wasn't already abroad in my network. And there is some sense in which in the late 1980s, mechanism ideas were beginning to spread. And I look back at my own writing and I see that around 1989, I start explicitly talking about causes as mechanisms and processes. I mean, I don't put together my own conceptual apparatus for a few more years, but by the time 1993, I've published a book called European Revolutions, 1492-1992. There's a lot of mechanism talk in that. That is, I set up the problem for that book by 1993 as a problem of identifying the recurrent mechanisms in revolutions without looking for general laws of revolution. And the claim of that book, which has fallen, I would say, largely on deaf ears, is that it's a mistake to look for the laws of revolution.
Good.
But that it is right to recognize that there are some recurrent mechanisms that occur in different combinations and different outcomes in a long series of revolutions. And I claim in the book that these mechanisms center around control of armed force. I mean, that's not the only issue, but I say, who controls armed force? Who has claims to armed force? How they deploy it? The organization of coercion is absolutely crucial, and there are a series of mechanisms that occur such that a whole regime polarizes over that issue, and you have at least two nodes of coercion struggling with each other. I mean, in some ways, it goes back to something that a former faculty member of the University of Michigan, Dearborn said. Peter Ammon was an old Trotskyist who wrote a wonderful article somewhere around 1972 called Revolution, a Redefinition. And he doesn't quite say so, but he certainly refers to Trotsky, so there's no question about that, but it's the notion of dual power. And that deeply impressed me. In fact, from the time that I read and met Peter Ammon, with whom I carried on a very interesting exchange for some years, especially when I was at Michigan, the idea that the mechanisms that produce dual power themselves are the central mechanisms in a revolutionary process. It turns out that Arthur Stinchcomb, one of the contemporary geniuses of social science, and an old Trotskyist, also has a notion of this general kind. In fact, in his great but neglected book, Theoretical Methods in Social History, he talks about Trotsky as one of the great social theorists and points to Trotsky's history of the Russian Revolution as an account. He doesn't there use the terminology of mechanisms, but basically what he says is, look, Trotsky actually recognizes that this event triggers this event, that they're contingent in some sense, that their concatenation is contingent, but lawful at this level. So that insight is already there in 1978, I think, that Theoretical Methods in Social History is coming out. I enjoy that book, especially because I edited it. I published it in a series I was then editing for Academic Press, and the preface, if you look at it, says, Charles Tilly caused there to be two elements that I had neglected in previous drafts, an introduction and a conclusion. All right, back to the mainstream. Yes, I mean, the answer to the question you asked me 10 minutes ago is, yes, I would have done that work differently if I had had the self-conscious control over ideas about mechanisms and processes that I've acquired since the late 1980s.